Let me just switch into Portuguese. I'd like to introduce now our second session. We're going to talk about gender-sensitive labor migration policies, about gender equality, both at national and regional level. And for this session, we have with us Gloria Moreno-Fontes, an expert on labor migration also for the ILO in Geneva. And she's going to do our presentation about gender-sensitive issues. So the methodology will be exactly the same. So we'll have Gloria's presentation first. You can also use the chat box to ask questions, make your own comments throughout the presentation. Then I will keep an eye on the chat box and I will collect all the questions and I will then group them together. And then at the very end, we will have a Q&A. I think we are all fully set and ready to go, so I'll pass the floor now to Gloria to start her presentation. Gloria, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Je vais parler en français parce que
I'm going to speak French because I know that most of the presentations have been held in English so far, and I know that after a while it's rather tiring to listen to interpretation all the time. So don't worry, because I will project and share my screen in English and presenting in French. So as Fernando introduced my presentation, we're going to speak about gender-sensitive labor migration policies, gender equality, and women migrant workers empowerment. So we really want to put the focus on awareness about gender equality and gender lenses throughout the migration process, and in particular for labor migration policies. So when we speak about gender-sensitive labor migration policies, I have to make a preamble here. So we need to take into account in the drafting of these policies all the differences that have been highlighted by the colleagues before me and those that will be highlighted in the following days. So, for example, anything concerning reliable data on labor migration are not gender sensitive, because it's so difficult to understand the impact on the different genders, the impact of migration on the different gender, and just even understanding where women mostly work, in which sectors, in which countries. And yet these are factors to be taken into account whenever drafting labor migration policies for governance, even in consideration of the skills issues that were just mentioned. So when dealing with brain drain, for example, it is crucial to understand whether there's a higher percentage of one gender or the other. When we literally lose or waste competencies and we are not able to exploit the qualifications acquired.
Ça va être avec les politiques qu'on va mettre en place. Est-ce que ça va
in the country of destination when migrating? So gender-sensitive labor migration policies and gender-sensitive data in particular can allow us to understand which jobs are mostly feminized For example, there are in the CEDAW region a recognition agreement covering certificates and diplomas mostly held by men. And that's why data too need to be gender sensitive. So this is just one example, recognition of credentials. We have recognition of architects, engineers, and doctors, so highly skilled individuals that hold diplomas and degrees that are usually held by men. So whenever we have to design qualification recognition systems and framework, we must be mindful of gender issues and gender equalities. So let's not create imbalances since the beginning. So I hope I can give you some interesting examples to be watchful of that and be able to attach the right importance to gender issues and gender lenses processes in order to have schemes and policies of labor migration that may not create disparities between genders. Generally speaking, labor migration policies should take into account the differences in social cultural needs and roles, the needs of men and women who can be extremely different, and the opportunities that are open thanks to these policies, opportunities of qualifications for men and women, or constraints and vulnerabilities for men and women because of migration processes. So, gender-sensitive labor migration policies must guarantee human rights, including labor rights, of course, thereby ensuring that they will give equal opportunities to both men and women migrant workers, so that all migrants, irrespective of their gender, can be treated equally in respect of employment and occupation, with a view to eliminating sex-based or gender-based, better saying, discrimination. So this is the main topic, this is the main goal. So the elimination of gender-based discrimination, both in the labor market and largely speaking in legislation, of course, in the reference jurisdiction. The main elements of gender-sensitive labor migration policies are that rights should be enjoyed by both men and women migrant workers, respecting the principles of gender equality and non-discrimination. And that this equality will be kept and maintained across the process. For example, gender-specific policies, sometimes they are needed. If discrimination is huge in a sector, or in the labor migration policies of a country, we need to find the balance back again and put things back into kilter again on the labor market. Of course, this doesn't happen in all markets and in all countries. So sometimes we really need positive discrimination actions in order to find balance again, just in cases one gender, one group is disproportionately affected by discrimination. So here you see some examples of these policies in the different phases of the migration cycle. Usually there are 5 different phases in every migration cycle, starting with decision-making, planning, and preparation of migration. Then we have recruitment and placing of our labor migrant. Then we have journey or transit to country of destination. Then we have working and living conditions abroad. And finally, we have return and reintegration to the country of origin. So I'd like to give you some examples of gender-sensitive labor migration policies. In particular, if we take the first phase, the phase of decision and then planning and preparation of migration, this kind of policies would give the same opportunity of regular migration and equal and safe migration, both to men and women, especially in certain countries. There's great pre-departure preparation to migrants. They are provided with information of the opportunities existing in the destination countries. They may be also provided with training courses aimed at a better knowledge and understanding of the situation found in the destination country, or just to be knowledgeable of their rights, the rights they are entitled. Language training courses, the language of destination countries. So it is crucial that anything provided in the pre-departure period can be equally accessed by either men or women. We spoke about BLAs yesterday, bilateral labor agreement. We need to be sure that our bilateral labor agreement ensure equal opportunities to men and women. Unfortunately, this is not often the case because they mainly deal with sectors where men takes the lion's share, like construction, for example. They are mainly hiring men rather than women. So they have a high concentration of men. So again, remember, whenever you draft bilateral labor agreement, you really need to be aware of the need of equal opportunities, both for men and women. Then on second phase, recruitment. Yesterday, you heard talking about fair recruitment or unfortunately, unfair recruitment, most of the time by private employment agencies or informal recruiters. So in this case, again, men may have better access to former employers or former recruiters than women. So let's try not to do so, not to make it come true. Let's try to avoid having illegal recruiters, because they are most likely to abuse nationals, and in particular, the more vulnerable nationals, in particular, women. So in phase 3, journey or transit to the country of destination, here again, we need to be aware of the need for gender-sensitive policies. So safe journey and protection against harassment or sexual or physical abuse during the journey for women. So your policies must include provisions that allow equal protection to all migrant workers, both men and women, during this phase. And then we get to the country of destination. So phase 4 concerns working and living conditions abroad, right? So labor migrants need to be ensured equal access to the labor market, compliance with contract provisions, the opportunity to keep their own ID documents and passport and not having them seized by the recruiter or the employers. So remember that these issues may affect women more than men, and try to think of what you can do to eliminate and avoid this discrimination, and what policies could help you do that. So how could you have employers respecting and complying with contractual provisions as for working hours, for example? Don't forget that there are sectors like domestic work where women take the lion's share. So they really need to be protected, because their rights are easily violated in such situation. Rights to have 1 day off work, regular working hours, or regular salaries, the salary that was provided for by the contract. Very frequently we see that nothing more than that. Women are just paid less than men for the same kind of job, and this is discrimination. So all these issues should be taken into account when you are in the phase of drafting bilateral labor agreement. So gender should always be a point at stake in order to give equal opportunities and protection of rights and protection of individual. Final phase of migration cycle is that you need to be sure that when coming back, when returning to their country of origin, women have the same opportunities as men to be reintegrated through vocational training, through recognition of qualification, and so on and so forth. So during this pandemic, many men and women migrants hadn't had the opportunity to join the social protection or social security scheme. Of course, this is due to the national legislation, because most of the times workers can join if their migration cycle had been of a certain time. So, for example, if they stay out more than 6 months, they won't have the opportunity to join it immediately. They will have to wait. So all these kind of issues must be considered when dealing with labor migration policies, and in particular, when we want our LMPs to be equitable and gender sensitive. So, this is the big question. Why do women migrants need specific legal protection? Mostly because of the low regard for women and the types of jobs they are mostly involved in. They are usually low-skilled or semi-skilled. And so they may be de-skilling. So before, our colleagues spoke about brain waste. And this is exactly the case. So de-skilling is really that. So if a person who has a certain level of qualification decides to migrate and finds a job with a lower level of qualification, of course, this can be configured as a de-skilling. And if this condition will go on for 5 or 10 years, will hinder them from going back to their country of origin and find a job that matches their qualification. So there are women, many women, so many women that migrate and find a job as a domestic worker in the country of destination. Just to earn their living. So when they come back in their country of origin, they are punished because they cannot show their professional experience. And so you can imagine, if the period is very long, they are just disconnected from the local labor market, and they have been disconnected for such a long time with no need with no possibility to show and to give evidence of their qualification, that they are just outside with no possibilities to enter it. And women may be discriminated against in different ways. So, for example, as for the salary is concerned, they are paid less than men. Or their employers may not pay them for months or years, and they just offer a much lower salary than the contractual salary. or they may be victims of violence, of harassment. They're very often affected by a lack of freedom during the weekends, for example, or just after the working hours. And mostly they are affected by bad working conditions. But there's much to that. They may be affected by inequalities as compared to the enjoyment of their rights. For example, they may have no rights to family reunification. So they may be left literally alone and abandoned to themselves for very long periods. And so this may have a very deep impact, not only on themselves, but also on their children, for example, left in the home country. So no family life for them, and maybe no childcare support services if ever they succeed in having their children with them. So because of this multi-layer discrimination, they often have no right to contribute to social security, mainly health coverage and pensions. And this is usually the case for domestic workers in many countries. In Switzerland, the ILO has strived to have the Swiss government accept to integrate domestic workers, foreign domestic workers, to join their social security scheme. So, and it covers also irregular migrant workers now, who can access to social security schemes of the country. So this is a great step forward. As I said before, discrimination as for the opportunities offered for regular migration. So we really need to find a balance again. Let's be mindful that sometimes there are sectors where women migrants just don't go, just don't work. So we have worked here again to review national legislation and their scope in order to ensure equal opportunities to men and women. And finally, sometimes women migrants end up being too dependent on the employer for their working and resident permit. So this entails abuses in different spheres. Abuses that may be perpetrated every day or as a usual practice against those women, for example, just not allowing them to change employer if they don't feel like staying with that one because they live in a condition of abuse, for example. So this should be enshrined in the legislation together with equal sanction for the abusers of employees. All right, so let's tackle now the rights of women, the rights to become parents, to have children. So they shouldn't be exposed to hazardous substances during pregnancies, for example, that may impair their capacity to have children. So, for example, chemical substances or hazardous substances in general. And this chains up with the need to protection of maternity. So to have the possibility to continue during a certain part of pregnancies, being sure that those women in general will be entitled to maternity leave and to have their job kept for them across this leave. So just to mention some of the discriminations they may be suffering from is the obligatory pregnancy tests, for example, for women migrants before they travel, or the prohibition to dismiss or deport those women when they become pregnant during employment. And this is not always the case. So those prohibitions are not always enshrined in national legislation. So we want to extend labor protection to all economic sectors and occupations. So especially where we can find a high concentration of women migrant workers. It is also paramount to design special measures to combat harmful gender stereotypes and discrimination in migration for employment. And then we need to detect so-called protective measures for women, which in practice just limit their entry into safe and productive migrant work. So, for example, they cannot travel starting from a certain age, allegedly to protect deportation or abuses. It would be better to have a certain and a whole set of comprehensive measures to ensure the access to legal remedies or the access to protection of their rights. So those so-called protective measures do not work because most of women migrant are migrating anyway, but in an irregular way through irregular channels, and so being exposed to more danger. So in order to eliminate or trying to eliminate this possibility, other kind of measures are needed, measures ensuring protection, comprehensive protection of women, and then give voice and representation to women migrants. And here we have the trade unions that step into the issue because it's up to them to campaign for women and being involved in decision-making processes when drafting labor migration policies. And then we need a higher flexibility as for the possibility to change employers and ensuring that there is no replacement of a new contract instead of the contract that was signed in the pre-departure phase. Because you know that many times the contract is changed, and the one based on which they are called to work in the country of destination has much lower protections and much disadvantaged and disadvantageous provisions for the employees. And then, of course, no withholding of ID documents, and because this may lead to slavery conditions, and then, of course, fair recruitment practices. All right, let's deal now with gender equality as compared to the ILO conventions. So in any situation they may be, and regardless of their sector.
And then the framework, which is made up of 6 conventions in terms of gender and 8 fundamental conventions comprising universal principles and rights at work that apply to all workers, regardless of nationality, residence, or migrant status, child labor, forced labor, anti-discrimination, freedom of association, right to organize, and collective bargaining. Then we have also the 2 migrant workers conventions that have been ratified by certain countries in Africa, Algeria, Burkina, Cameroon, Kenya, Madagascar, Malawi, Mauritius, Morocco, Nigeria, Tanzania, Zanzibar, and Zambia. This for Convention 97. And then Convention 143 that has been ratified by Benin, Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Guinea, Kenya, Madagascar, Mauritania, Togo, and Uganda. Now we'll see the 6 gender equality conventions. So we enter a little bit more into the details. So we have some specific aspects to be underlined. So we have the convention, the equal remuneration for men and women workers for work of equal value, that is Convention 100. This is yes, Convention 100. It has been ratified by most countries, 173 ratifications. Then we have discrimination in respect to employment and occupation that has been widely ratified by 175 countries, and it is Convention number 111. And most of the African countries have ratified this convention. Then we have Workers with Family Responsibilities Convention, number 156, that has been ratified by 45 countries. Then we have Convention 183 about maternity protection, that has been ratified by 39 countries. Then we have a convention that has been adopted in 2011 concerning decent work for domestic workers, that is Convention 189, that has been ratified by 31 countries. And then we have the Convention on Violence and Harassment in the World of Work, that is Convention 109, Treaty, and it has been ratified by 4 countries. I believe Namibia has already ratified it. These are the main conventions concerning gender. So 6 conventions I have mentioned here, and I will try to see some aspects of these conventions. I'd like to speak about Convention 189 and the Recommendation 201, which covers all domestic workers, including migrant workers. So migrant workers are included in this convention. This convention 189 has been ratified by Guinea, Mauritius, Namibia, Madagascar, and South Africa. The instruments do not make a distinction between workers and citizens, so on the basis of citizenship or residency status. There are some provisions in this convention which are specific for vulnerabilities of migrant domestic workers. And we have specifically Article 8 concerning the employment contract and repatriation conditions, Article 15 mentioning the need to do monitoring and evaluations, and then we have Article 9 dealing with all daily, weekly rest, annual leaves, travel, and identity documents. So the need to have paid rests and so on. So in this case, we need to ensure, according to this article, that workers can keep their ID documents and passports and so on. So documents must not be withdrawn by the employer. We have to say that 1 out of 5 workers in the world are 1 out of 5 domestic workers work in another country. There are we can say that mostly of domestic workers are women, and we have to say that women are often exposed to gender-based violence and abuse. So this means that we really need to stress the importance to work on this topic. Then we have Recommendation 204 concerning transition from the informal to formal economy. So in this recommendation, migrants are considered as specifically vulnerable to the most serious decent work deficits in the informal economy. This recommendation is valid for all workers, applies to all workers and economic units, so including enterprises, entrepreneurs, households in the informal economy. So everything is included, and all these economic units are included. And which is the objective? facilitate the transition of workers and economic units from the informal to the formal economy while respecting workers' fundamental rights. This is one goal, and this is also a common ground with the convention. And then the other goal is to promote creation, preservation, and sustainability of decent jobs in the formal economy. And last but not least, prevent the informalization of formal economy jobs. Then we have Convention 190 about violence and harassment in the world of work. In this convention, there is a definition of the term violence and harassment. So the term violence and harassment in the world of work refers to a range of unacceptable behaviors and practices or threats thereof, whether a single occurrence or repeated, that aim at, result in, or are likely to result in physical, physiological, sexual, or economic harm. And this includes gender-based violence and harassment. I see my colleague suggesting harassment in French. Okay, so this is something we see in the world of work. So women are often subject to violence and harassment, and these has some impacts on psychology, on their life. So this term, no, we have also the term gender-based violence and harassment, which means violence and harassment directed to people because of their sex, their gender, or affecting people of a particular sex or gender, and this includes sexual harassment. So this is another term that is defined in the convention.
Right. Let's see now the provisions of Convention 190 on violence and harassment in the world of work. So here are the different provisions. So each member should adopt an inclusive and integrated and gender-responsive approach. And how should they do that? Through the following actions. The following actions, of course, include the prohibiting violence and harassment in the legislation, then ensuring that relevant policies address violence and harassment, adopting a complete strategy in order to implement measures to prevent and combat violence and harassment, then establishing or strengthening enforcement and monitoring mechanisms against violence and harassment, of course, ensuring access to remedies and support for victims. Those policies should also providing for sanctions against violations of such provisions, and then develop tools, guidance, education and training, and raising awareness in accessible formats as appropriate. And last but not least, ensuring effective means of inspection and investigation case to detect violence and harassment cases and then respond through the line institutions, for example, labor inspectorates or other competent bodies to eliminate the violation. So here you see the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination against Women. So it includes a specific recommendation on women migrant workers. It's General Recommendation number 26. It covers mainly a wide scope, considering the situations and discriminations that could affect women, especially in low salary jobs or low paid jobs that may be at higher risk of abuse and discrimination. So the general recommendation says that women migrant workers who migrate independently, those who join their spouses or other members of who are also workers, and even undocumented women migrant workers who may fall into any of the above categories could be considered at risk of abuse and at risk of discrimination, much more often than men migrant workers. So General Recommendation number 26 also includes the idea that female migration should be studied through gender lenses, so from the perspective of gender inequality and traditional female roles, and the awareness that should be raised about the real discrimination existing and segregation existing in the labor market of several countries. And then the universal prevalence of gender-based violence and worldwide feminization of poverty and labor migration. So, as I said, feminization is one point at stake because it is often accompanied with poverty across the migration cycle, and because of it. So the General Recommendation 26 includes recommendation to the member states about common responsibilities of countries of origin and destination, or specific to countries of origin, transit, destination, and bilateral regional cooperation and monitoring and reporting. So there is also another point to be tackled when dealing with jurisdiction. We have General Comment number 1 on migrant domestic workers in the concluding observations by the Committee of Migrant Workers on female migrant workers. So these general comments reads that recognizing the most domestic workers are women and girls, and taking into consideration their role, the gender labor market, the universal prevalence of gender-based violence, and the worldwide feminization of poverty and labor migration, states should incorporate a gender perspective in efforts to understand the specific problems and develop remedies to the gender-based discrimination that they face throughout the migration cycle. In addition, States should repeal sex-specific bans because all these discrimination restrictions on women migrations on the basis of age, marital status, pregnancy, or maternity status are discriminating. So it really demands a wider perspective for the states. Another interesting question here is that in some countries there's a need for women to supply or to submit their demand to migrate regularly, accompanied with the permission of the spouse or male guardian. So this should be eliminated. Here you see general comment number 2 on the rights of migrant workers in an irregular situation and members or their families. So migrant workers as a whole. This is not restricted to regular migration, and this is not restricted by gender, right? So here you have comment number 1, stating that migrant workers in an irregular situation, particularly women, are at increased risk of ill treatment across the migration cycle, and including by subjects, including employers, for example, private actors and state officials. And this ill treatment or form of violence includes sexual violence, beatings, threats, psychological abuse, or even denial of access to medical care. So, general comment number 2 states that all states parties have an obligation to protect all migrant workers and members of their families against those kind of violence. In addition, they are required to adopt and implement legislation prohibiting such acts that effectively investigate cases of abuse and violence, prosecute and punish those responsible with appropriate punishments, provide reparation and remedy to victims and members of their families, provide human rights training for public officials for them to be ready and prepared to deal with those cases, and then effectively monitor the conduct of state agents, and in particular also regulate the conduct of private persons and entities in order to prevent such act, so that the migration process can be smooth and free from violence. All right, so that's all for me. And if I may, I'd like to leave the rest of the session for Q&A session. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks a lot. I see that we have 2 questions in the forum. Okay, let's start with the first one, and may I invite the participants to post their questions on the chat. So first question concerns migration of women to Asian countries and to Arab states. So the participant mentions a particularly complicated situation in those two regions because of the risk of human trafficking. So the question concerns the existence of specific bodies and entities in charge of protecting the rights of women. This is the first question. Okay, we may start with this. All right. Yes, there are, at least in certain countries.
Please go ahead, Gloria. We just temporarily muted you. Please unmute yourself.
Dans certains pays, il y a de plus en plus.
As I said, we have seen the creation of an increasingly high number of such entities, starting from NGOs, for example, not to mention the trade unions that have been involved in such phase of protections through access to justice, for example, even independent trade unions that decide to work with migrant or women migrants who may be in difficult situations. Lebanon, for example, may have a government which is rather deprived of entities and bodies that would respond immediately to the migrants' needs. We find other kind of entities, such as trade unions, for example, that are present and active in the provision of services and support to migrant workers, and in particular to women workers in case of abuse. Qatar is another example because they are starting to implement a new legislation, Kuwait too, and Jordan. So these last countries have launched a process of revision of their legislation in order to include also those kinds of remedies. UAE and Saudi Arabia still hinder the opening of this kind of services, unfortunately, because there are no unions, no freedom of associations, for example. But these are just examples. Thanks a lot, Gloria. Okay, second question. It is a specific question concerning pregnancy tests. So the question is in English: suppose the pregnancy tests are carried out with the aim of providing special attention protection to pregnant women while in transit. Is it also wrong? What do you think, Gloria? All right, so if it is aimed at this goal, maybe it's not wrong. However, I need to review the convention because usually tests shouldn't be taken. So people shouldn't be obliged to undertake any kind of test. If ever tests are present, they should not be there as a pitfall for women in order to prevent them from migrating whenever they may be positive to those tests. That's perfect. I see another point made concerning so-called marriage of convenience, irrespective of gender. I'd like to have your opinion about that, and if you could speak about that. All right, this is no issue covered by the ILO, actually. So people who got married to have visas or passports, I suppose you mean this kind of situation. All I can say is that the ILO is not involved in this kind of issues. So, no more questions for the moment. All right, so if you have any other question, just use the chat. All right, so we have some more minutes before we wrap up the session. So in the meantime, Gloria, would you have any final remark in the meantime? Well, actually, may I remind you that we will have another course of sessions on labor migration policies. Usually, it should be held in May. And in that course, all these issues will be treated in depth. I can tell you that SADC has got its own action plan used to outline a clear framework for labor migration policies, and one of the demands to the member states from this action plan is that labor migration policies should be designed by the member states. So 4 countries are already have these policies in the pipeline and have worked with us to implement them. Okay, another short question. Is it possible, according to your experience, to include some feminine clauses, so to say, in migration policies? I don't know what you mean when you say feminine clauses. However, as I said before, migration may have a very discriminatory result in the life of the persons. So there are provisions that can help balance or let's say diminish, if not eliminating, this discrimination. A very technical question. What is the difference between gender and sex according to the ILO?
Pour l'OIT, quelle est la différence entre les deux termes?
Bon, là, je pense que c'est une question pour UN Women et pour les agences spécialistes.
Well, if I understand correctly, anything connected to the gender deals with attitudes and behavior, while sex is connected with the biology of a person.
Je crois que nous avons épuisé les questions.
Okay, so
Dans le chat. Alors,
all right, so
j'imagine alors que nous pouvons, s'il y a plus de questions, que nous pouvons.
so I think we have no more questions. So today we're going to be very, very sharp. So there's a question concerning ratification of Convention 189. I can tell you this is one of ILO's priority to accelerate, to speed up ratification of this convention. However, I can tell you that ratification is one step, but it's not enough. You need to implement what the convention says. And of course, we start with ratification, and of course, we will cover the question of women migrants. Thank you, Gloria. Thank you. Sorry, I didn't see it. There's another one. So, how can we help women migrants who just fall victims of human trafficking when they are exploited by their employers? So, of course, the ILO deals with anything concerning forced labor and human trafficking. This is linked to all indicators concerning labor in general. And so, how can we solve this question? Well, this is $1 million question. It's a huge work that needs a coordination and cooperation of institutions in the country of origin and in the country of destination. So I think you refer to employers in the destination countries who may perpetrate abuses and exploitation against their employees. Well, monitoring is the main key, mostly in domestic work, which is one sector where abuses and exploitations are less easily detected. So, first and foremost, the sanctions should be enshrined in the legislation of the destination countries so that employers may be discouraged. So, again, we need to deal with national regulations, especially in destination countries, and the measures that can result from the coordination of different institutions. And may I call on a special attention by the country of origins during negotiation, for example, of bilateral labor agreement, that this monitoring action is implemented and is included in the agreement by the country of destination. Thank you. Thank you very much, Gloria. Well, I think we can call it a day for our session. No, there's another one.
Comment améliorer la question des données?
So, for example, how can we strengthen the data with regard to domestic workers? Because usually most women use informal crossings to move from one country to another to get a job. And this makes it difficult for a country of origin to have the data. So very quickly, maybe something about data. Don't worry, because statistics will be one of the topic tomorrow. And not only concerning formal statistics, but also informal statistics, or better, statistics on informal migration flows. So there are surveys designed for certain region considered at higher migration flows. So these surveys will help capturing these informal migration flows. So just forgive me if I'm not answering now, but I will tomorrow. So one very, very last question about the likelihood for migrant workers who wish to return to their own countries while pregnant. Okay, if I understand correctly, of course they can go back to their own country. Well, I understand that the participants would like to know the percentage of women migrant workers who are pregnant and decide to go back to their country. I hope it's correct. Well, as I said before, there are many employers who ask their employee to go back. I don't know the share, but I know it's a high share. Because as soon as the employer realizes that the person is pregnant, then they decide, most of them decide to send them back. And the percentage of male and female migrant workers around the world can be found in the Global Migrant Workers Estimates, which is published every year by the ILO. So totally, we have 49% of men and 51%, 49% of women and 51% of men. That should be right. So another question about data. Is there a mechanism being developed to record disaggregated data of movement regarding migrant workers in the SADC region? So Jessie will answer those questions tomorrow. I don't know whether he's here, but all these questions concerning statistics and data will be answered tomorrow. Jessie, are you here?
I'm here.
Can you please respond to that question?
Whether there's a mechanism being developed to record disaggregated data of movement regarding migrant workers in the SADC region. Yes, I can. We are working on a mechanism to record data on migrant workers in the region. Whether we can get data that's accurate enough at the national level to record flows, movements, is something that we need to still discuss with our partners, statistical offices at national levels, because it really depends on the capacity to record those flows within each country. But to the extent that we can provide a coordinated mechanism at the SADC level, yes, we are definitely working towards that.
Okay, perfect, thank you.
Très bien, très bien. Alors,
all right. So, as I said before, we can call it a day because we are already running late. So, Isham, may I leave you the floor for an announcement whatsoever before we close the session?
Thank you, Fernando. Thank you for this. Thank you, everybody, for this amazing session. Very few announcements is if you are not able yet to access the platform, or if you have not received the link, just send us an email at migration@itcilo.org. You'll find it again on the chat. So please just make sure you do that. If you have any issues with accessing, if you have trouble with your password, just send us that, because it's very important that you access the platform, because that is where the tests are going to be available, or the documentation is going to be available, or the videos are going to be available. And obviously all the presentations are going to be available. I think that's all for me. I would just like to ask our interpreters to stay behind after everybody's gone, if for 5 minutes, if possible. Thank you, Fernando.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you. So that's it for today, and we're waiting you tomorrow at the same time. Have a nice afternoon, and see you tomorrow.